If you get a license agreement wrong, you don't just lose leverage, you may be losing control of your technology, your brand, a revenue stream, or even your exit. Here are the top 5 mistakes that businesses make when negotiating a license agreement. Let's get into it. Mistake number 1, focusing solely on price instead of scope. The first thing you think about when you're entering into a license agreement is what's the price? What is the royalty rate? What is the upfront payment? You're looking at only the economics. These aspects are important, but you're missing the real value of the license, which is the scope. Scope includes what intellectual property is actually licensed, what fields of use are covered, what territories are included, what geographic regions are included. Can the licensee sub-license that IP to third parties? Can the licensee transfer the license to another third party? You want to define in the agreement the specific IP that's actually going to be licensed. If you're the licensor, you're the one granting the license, and you grant broad scope in your license to a third party, you may actually be unintentionally blocking yourself from doing things you want to do in the future. Conversely, if you're on the other side of the deal, if you're the licensee and the scope is too narrow, you may not have the freedom to use that IP in the fashion that you plan to do so in your business. I often see the definition of field of use being too vague or overly broad. This can create problems down the road, specifically because the way you're using IP or the way a third party is going to use IP, the way a licensee is going to use IP in the future is likely different than the way they're using it today. And you want to make sure that that field of use is properly defined so that the way you're using it today also covers the way you intend to use it tomorrow. Put very simply, you can easily outgrow a license tomorrow or give away optionality in the future. So here's the key takeaway. Scope in the license drives value more than the economics. Mistake number 2, granting exclusivity without guardrails. Exclusivity is a powerful tool, and it's something that licensees want off the bat. They want exclusivity because they don't want other people potentially using that IP the way that they plan on using it. But exclusivity without performance obligations as a licensor is frankly quite risky. So here are the key questions to consider whenever you're granting an exclusive license. Are there minimum sales requirements? In return for that exclusivity, you need to at least hit these minimum numbers, whether it's sales numbers or minimum royalty, may or may not make sense, because if they underperform, then as licensor, you're potentially losing money from granting licenses to other third parties. Are there development milestones? It makes sense to make sure that that third party, that licensee that has an exclusive license, who is not selling licensed products tomorrow, but selling licensed products down the road after the development is done, to potentially pay development milestones or to reach development milestones. Or as licensor to say, I know this is not fully baked, but I can't have you shelve the technology. So making sure that there are development milestones in place may be something you want to think about. Is exclusivity tied to performance? Because I can't license to third parties, I need to make sure that you're continuing to sell products at a level that I've expected. Can exclusivity convert to non-exclusivity if target performance metrics aren't met? So keep in mind, when you grant someone an exclusive license, you're in essence making a bet that that single licensee will sell enough products and pay the amount of royalties that warrants not granting a license to their competitors. The key takeaway here is that when you're granting an exclusive license, think about whether or not it needs to be tied to performance. Mistake number 3, having weak royalty or audit rights. Royalty clauses look straightforward. It's typically licensee sells X amount of products and pay licensor Y amount of royalties. It's just simply not that straightforward. The way this goes sideways is oftentimes the amount of royalties are tied to net sales. And here, the devil's gonna be in the details. Having a poor definition up front in that agreement can confuse the parties and, worst of all, create disputes down the road in how you calculate the amount of royalties that should be really paid. Audit rights are also one of those areas where I think a lot of folks think it's standard and they just see audit rights and glaze over. Unfortunately, the audit is one of the few areas in a license agreement in which the licensor has the ability within within the bounds of the agreement and without terminating the agreement to go in and double check the math, look at the books, make sure that the royalties that they're being paid are actually correct. When you're talking about audit rights, you want to make sure that things like the frequency in which you can do an audit, what late fees have to be paid if the audit is wrong, who has to pay the auditor in the event that the amount of royalties that were paid weren't correct, and by how much they weren't correct. In these two sections, poor drafting can not only create headaches down the road, but also litigation risk as well. Key takeaway here is royalty definitions and audit rights need to be precise. Mistake number 4, failing to address ownership and improvements clearly. So when you're granting a license to IP, you don't always envision that that IP will be further developed or changed or altered by the licensee. Even though you don't think that this will happen, the agreement absolutely should contemplate this. The licensee is going to take that technology and they may realize how to build a better mousetrap. You need to figure out who's going to own that. Does the licensee own it because they're the one who developed it and created it? Does the licensor own it because the licensee could not have done that but for their license of the IP that you gave them? Who owns derivative works? If you are licensing software, if you're licensing another work of authorship, can that licensee use that and create something that's a little different? And if they do create that something that's a little different, if it's a derivative work, who's gonna own that? As a licensor, do you want a licensee to be able to block you from using that derivative work because they own it? At the very least, the agreement shouldn't be silent on these issues. In a lot of instances, specifically in life sciences, if there's further development involved, if they're running trials, there's gonna be something other than just clear IP. There might just be data. Who's gonna own that? In our world where IP is oftentimes iterative, it's not game-changing, improvements, minor improvements on the IP that's licensed to licensees is often quite valuable. And so defining who's gonna have ownership of it, who's gonna be able to use it, does that automatically get added to the license, is absolutely something we need to think about. Additionally, if the agreement says perhaps the licensor owns all of the improvements automatically that the licensee creates, well, that might discourage the licensee from making any improvements at all, from furthering the technology. How does that affect the licensor long term in that IP? Or its ability to monetize it. Conversely, if improvements are automatically owned by the licensee, that can easily cause the licensor to lose control of that IP that they may want to use going forward, or they may want other licensees to be able to use. If you haven't figured it out already, there's no universal answer for how to handle or manage improvements in licenses. It's going to be situation specific. So here's the key takeaway. Ownership of improvements needs to be clearly defined in the agreement. Absence of defining what you're going to do creates risk for both parties. Mistake number 5, ignoring termination and exit mechanics. When you start dating somebody, you don't think about how should we break up. That being said, deciding early on in the relationship, in the agreement, what happens to each party, what happens to the IP, what happens to sublicenses, can really, really save you headaches down the road. So the things to think about are, what triggers termination? How easy is it for both parties to terminate? If you're the licensee and the agreement can be terminated by the licensor for minor breaches, well, that may put your product line and all the investments you've made into that product line at risk. Conversely, if you're the licensor and termination rights are too limited, you may be stuck in a dysfunctional relationship. You may be in a position where you can't terminate, where in reality you really want to, or you frankly should be able to. Is there a cure period if that thing that triggers termination occurs? What happens to inventory? How do they get rid of that? Is there a time period in which they need to get rid of it? Is there a time period in which they're no longer allowed to get rid of it? What happens to sublicenses? If that licensee has the ability to sublicense, they may grant sublicenses. If the relationship falls apart and it ends up getting terminated, do they automatically transfer to you as licensor, or do they automatically terminate as well? What happens to confidential information and know-how? What happens to the IP that you granted them licenses to? Do they have to give it back? Are they allowed to continue to use it for a certain period of time? Do they have to cease using it immediately? If it was data and know-how, how do you make sure that that data and know-how can no longer be used by them? Is it deleted? Is it removed? Is confidentiality maintained? Even though it may be an uncomfortable part of the conversation, These are the types of things the agreement should specify at the beginning stages of a relationship. The key takeaway here is termination rights can shape long-term leverage. At the end of the day, either party's ability to terminate a license agreement is leverage that that party has to keep the other party in line. Those are the top 5 mistakes when negotiating a license agreement. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.